thank you everyone for the wonderful presentations that we've already seen today. I think it's great to see that so many of you, of us, have taken the opportunity to collect data during the COVID pandemic. I also think that it's good to also keep in mind that for perhaps some of us, at least for me and Chris, the COVID pandemic also meant that we couldn't finish some of the touch projects that we were working on, because it's difficult to compare data from before the COVID pandemic to data that we are collecting in the future. But I do think that this COVID pandemic has brought us also some positive things, namely that we can get more information on what touch deprivation means to people. And that is something that we have focused on in our study. So one of the things that we've immediately thought of when the COVID pandemic started and the social distancing regulations became in effect is this a problem that we cannot touch each other anymore as often as we did? And this is what we wanted to investigate in a study, because in the media there was a lot of attention for this, at least in the Netherlands, and I also think in other countries. And we wanted to give a sort of a scientific viewpoint on this. So in the Dutch media, we heard a lot about the word huidhonger, which roughly translated means skin hunger. And I think I also saw in some international media some articles on this topic. And we wanted to give us a scientific viewpoint on this. So what we wanted to focus on specifically is, are we actually touch deprived? Because this is what we heard a lot around us. People miss touch so much, and we wanted to figure out how touch deprived are we actually at this point. We also wanted to know which individuals are most likely to experience touch deprivation, but also we wanted to focus on how do we now during COVID-19 experience affective touch? And is touch deprivation perhaps also linked to an altered appraisal of affective touch? And we also wanted to focus on, but this is still work in progress, on whether touch deprivation is linked to quality of life. So these are 5 research questions that I will try to squeeze in this talk. So first of all, I will explain our experiment. So we had several parts of the experiment, and the experiment always was an online experiment, obviously. The experiment started with showing participants movie clips of affective touch. And one of the movie clips was slow stroking, and one of the clips was fast stroking. And we then asked participants, after watching each of the clips, to rate these clips on likability. So how do you think the person giving the touch would rate this touch on a scale from very pleasant to unpleasant? How would you rate the video clip? How much would you like to be touched like this? To get an indication of how pleasant participants found these video clips. We also asked participants to complete some demographic questions on age, gender, the type of regulations that were in effect in their country, whether they had a romantic partner, their living situation, their employment situation, were they working from home, or could they still work on location? And we also asked them about their mental and physical health status. We then asked participants 2 questions to get an idea of their level of touch deprivation, and we asked them to indicate whether they would prefer to touch others more or less, and whether they would prefer to be touched more or less by others. And we included the World Health Organization Quality of Life questionnaire that assesses quality of life on 4 different domains. We had a lot of participants that started our survey, more than 4,000, and more than 2,000 participants completed the survey, which is still quite a good response, I think, because we just shared it in our own network. So we didn't use Mechanical Turk or whatever. So we really had a community sample. The demographics of our sample are that the mean age was about 38 years old. The majority was female of the participants. The majority of the participants lived in the Netherlands, and the average duration of COVID regulations at the time of testing was 45.92 days. Most participants lived with housemates that could either be a partner, children, family, or friends with whom they had a good relationship. And it's good to mention that we collected data between April and October 2020. The majority of the data was collected before the summer of 2020, so between April and July. As for the research questions, we first wanted to see what the level of touch deprivation was of our participants. And we found that on a scale from 0 to 10, participants almost scored an 8 on longing for touch. So they wanted to be touched more and touch more for quite a high amount, at least in my opinion. But of course, we didn't know that this pandemic would hit, so we don't have data from these participants on their level of touch deprivation before the COVID pandemic. So we can make a direct comparison to get an indication of whether their level of touch deprivation had worsened due to the COVID pandemic. But we can make a more or less visual comparison to previous work. So one of the studies that also reports the level of touch deprivation of a quite big sample of participants is a study by Bessler and colleagues. And they used a different way of assessing longing for touch. They have a very extensive questionnaire with which they assessed it. So it's different than our 2 questions. But still, they report that 72% of their sample was touch deprived. And this is before the COVID pandemic. And in our study, we found that 87% of our sample was touch deprived. So it seems to be an increase, but of course, it's very difficult to compare this statistically. But this at least gives an idea of that it might be possible that people are more touch deprived during the COVID pandemic, which is of course not very surprising. We then wanted to see which individuals are most likely to experience higher levels of touch deprivation. And what we did is that we set up a regression model in which we checked if several socio-demographic variables were able to predict the level of touch deprivation. And we included in our model the duration of COVID regulations, the severity of COVID regulations, gender of the participants, their mental and physical health status, their living situation, so whether they lived alone or with housemates with whom they had or did not have a good quality relationship. And we also looked at work situations, so working from home or working at location. And overall, this model significantly predicted touch deprivation, and we found a few significant predictors. First of all, touch deprivation increased as the duration of COVID regulations increased. We also found that participants who were in a lockdown, as compared to participants who got the advice not to shake hands, the participants who were socially distancing, and the participants who were in a complete lockdown, had higher levels of touch deprivation. So it seemed that the participants in a lockdown were worst off in terms of touch deprivation. And we found that living with other people with whom you have a good quality relationship seems a protective factor against touch deprivation, because these people had lower levels of touch deprivation. We then also wanted to see what the effect of the COVID pandemic would be on affective touch perception. And Rochelle already explained what affective touch is, so I don't have to do that. That is really nice. And we found in our sample that participants after watching the slow stroking video rated that video as more pleasant than after watching the fast stroking video. So it seems that also for observing videos of affective touch, we find the results that we usually find in-person experiments, showing that participants find slow stroking more pleasant than fast stroking. And this also more or less replicates previous work of before the pandemic that also used videos of touch instead of an in-person setup. We then also wanted to know if perhaps touch deprivation would be linked to affective touch perception. And we again included in a regression model several socio-demographic variables and also touch deprivation. And we found that for the affective touch videos depicting the slow stroking, this regression model was a significant predictor, was significantly predicting the pleasantness ratings. And specifically, we found that as touch deprivation increased, participants also found the slow stroking video more pleasant. We also found that participants who were in a complete lockdown, as opposed to the other levels of COVID regulations, were rating the slow touch videos as more pleasant. And we also found that as age increased, participants found slow touch videos more pleasant. We did the same for the non-affective touch videos in which the touch was very fast. And again, we found that this model could significantly predict how pleasant participants found these videos. And here we found that again, with increasing levels of touch deprivation, also pleasantness ratings of non-affective touch videos increased. And that participants in a complete lockdown found it more pleasant to watch non-affective touch videos than participants in under other COVID regulation restrictions. And I think it's interesting that we found that affective touch perception was influenced or at least linked to touch deprivation in the opposite way, but then it was found in a previous study, for example, a study by Rochelle, because there it was found that the more touch deprived participants were, the less they liked affective touch. And we actually find the opposite. The more touch deprived participants are, the more they like watching these videos. And there are, of course, a few important differences between our study and the study by Rochelle. First of all, Rochelle used an actual in-person affective touch paradigm, and we didn't. But another major difference is that in Rochelle's study, participants were touch deprived in an unrestricted society. So in our study, everyone was deprived of touch, or at least needed to adhere to social distancing measures. So that is, of course, a big difference. And perhaps in Rochelle's study, the participants who were touch deprived were the ones that already had a smaller social network, perhaps. And in our study, everyone had still their own social network. There's the same amount of friends. They could still contact these people, but they just could not touch them. So that might explain some of these differences. And so what we found is that when participants are more touch deprived, they are more inclined to rate touch videos as more pleasant, more appealing. And perhaps a similar thing has happened in our study as what happens when you deprive participants of, for example, food. So previous studies showed that when participants are very hungry, when they are food deprived, they find high calorie food stimuli more appealing. So perhaps in a COVID society, when we are touch deprived, we find stimuli depicting touch also more appealing. So that's a possible explanation for our results. What we also wanted to look at is whether touch deprivation would be linked to quality of life. And these are still preliminary results because we are still doing analysis. But what we found on the physical health domain is that quality of life decreases as touch deprivation increases and as the strictness of the COVID regulations increase. We also found that the psychological quality of life it becomes worse as touch deprivation increases and as the COVID regulations become more strict. As for the quality of life on the social aspect, so the quality of our social relationships, that decreases as touch deprivation increases and as the duration of the COVID regulations increase. And for the environmental quality of life, we only found a significant link to the severity of the regulations. So our environmental quality of life becomes worse when the severity of the COVID regulations increases. And again, we cannot directly compare this to quality of life of our participants before the COVID pandemic. But one of our students was able to make a comparison of our quality of life scores to norm scores of a healthy Dutch sample from 2015 that was assessed with the same quality of life questionnaire. And we also found an article reporting this quality of life questionnaire in a substantial psychiatric Dutch sample from 2016. So if we visually compare these two samples to the results that we found for quality of life, we see sort of this happening. With respect to physical quality of life, we see that in the COVID population that we assessed, there isn't really a big difference compared to the healthy Dutch sample, and their quality of life is also much better than that of a psychiatric sample. When we look at the psychological quality of life, we see that in the healthy Dutch sample, this is quite high. It's lower in the Dutch psychiatric sample from 2016, and it's actually in the COVID sample that we assessed, it's not very different from the psychiatric population, and it seems at first glance a little bit different, lower than in the healthy Dutch sample. When we look at the social quality of life, we see that again, that the COVID population that we assessed in our study is much lower than for the healthy Dutch sample, and that it's at least at first glance, it seems also to be lower than the quality of life of a psychiatric sample, which is quite worrying, I think. And for environmental quality of life, we don't see many differences. But I think especially with respect to the social quality of life, it is really a shame that we cannot directly compare this statistically, but at least it gives an indication that our quality of life might have changed during the COVID pandemic. As said, this is still work in progress. We're still doing analysis on this. But for the affective touch part of our study, we have published this as a preprint, and we still need to submit this. But this paper is out there, and I think it would be interesting to also read the other papers of the people that have presented here, so we can also cite each other in our studies and also compare the different studies to each other. I think one of the downsides of our study and of many studies that started after the COVID pandemic has started, that it's really difficult to determine cause and effect, because it's really difficult to say whether the COVID pandemic has causally reduced our quality of life or has increased our level of touch deprivation. But nevertheless, I think it is definitely interesting to have a lot of studies now on the topic of touch deprivation during the COVID-19 pandemic, because it is definitely food for thought, and it will for sure lead to new hypotheses and result in new interesting experiments that we can start. And one of the things that our study has definitely led to is that it also, at least in the Netherlands, raised awareness on the topic of touch. So this is a screenshot from a Dutch TV program where I am actually effectively touching the presenter with my effective touch brush duct taped to a long stick, so I could keep 1.5 meters distance. But in the Netherlands, there was a lot of media attention for our study, and we really also took this opportunity to raise awareness for the topic of touch and the importance of touch. And I think that is also a very important spin-off of the project that we have done. So taken together, what we showed is that touch deprivation is predicted by a longer duration of COVID regulations that increases touch deprivation. And we also saw that people who live with housemates with whom they have a good quality relationship have the lowest level of touch deprivation. And it was also significantly associated to the level of strictness of COVID regulations. And we also found that videos of effective touch were rated as more pleasant as touch deprivation and the strictness of regulations and age increased. And perhaps effective touch becomes more appealing as we miss this more. And we also found that different aspects of quality of life are associated with levels of touch deprivations, with higher levels of touch deprivation being linked to a lower level of quality of life. So I think this is already interesting, and this has definitely for us led to setting up some new projects. So we are now working on a study on touch deprivation in psychiatric patients, and we are also setting up an experiment at a public engagement event to investigate how we experience interpersonal touch in an actual in-person experiment that we have probably all missed a lot doing. And I have also included a QR code that you can scan. And this is, if you scan it, you will go to a short documentary on how people with a psychiatric disorder experience social distancing during the COVID-19 pandemic. We got a little bit of funding for making 3 short documentaries, and I think this turned out to be a wonderful project that also raises awareness for touch deprivation in psychiatric patients. And as for these future projects, I really hope that during, for example, a next effective touch meeting, we can meet in person to further discuss these. And that's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anouk. That's really, really interesting work and a very clear presentation. It's just so nice that everyone can present even this preliminary data and still show the effects. I mean, you've got such a big sample size. That's, having so many responses is amazing. That's a great data set to work with.
Yeah, definitely.
So while we wait for maybe some questions to come in, so if anyone wants to post any questions, feel free to do so in the chat in YouTube. But yeah, you've already got some really, really interesting data that generates questions already, which is great. For me, I thought it was very interesting how as age increased, the pleasantness of touch increased. And so this is an online experiment, so it's vicarious touch as well. So it was a study by Schellstedt et al. In 2016. I was part of it. We did show that as touch, as age increased, the pleasantness of touch increased. Why do you think this is? Because we weren't sure either. Why? Have you got any idea why this may be?
I'm not really sure. I think maybe one of the things that might influence this is that I think generally as age increases, perhaps the amount of touch we receive decreases. So I think that when you're very young, you are touched a lot by your parents. Then when you enter puberty, adolescence, young adulthood, you might also frequently engage in touch. Perhaps then you start your own family and you have a lot of touch interactions with your young children. But perhaps after that, maybe our touch interactions decrease, while perhaps the need for touch does not necessarily decrease. And that might explain why, as we get older, we might appreciate the touch that we do get more.
Yeah, and I think exactly. I think that people appreciate touch, because from an anatomical standpoint, we do lose the touch kind of afferents, the receptors.
Yeah.
However, it's so interesting that the pleasantness increases. And that's not to say, Joe, we're not growing more CT afferents and things like this. If anything, we're losing the input that we're receiving from our skin. And so I think it's so nice to see that studies confirm, and in different ways, that as you get older, you have this kind of appreciation for touch, and that it's not something that's lost. It's actually something that grows throughout the lifetime.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that also underlines that it's not only the CT system that's important for how we appreciate and rate touch, affective touch, but that it's also very much influenced by top-down factors.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So we have a question. Going say that there's comments, people saying thank you, brilliant to hear, from Jean Barlow, and as I think it's probably Merle from Social Bridges. It says, I think as we age, the touch we receive is touch that we choose as well. So that's very true, you know. And if your social circles decrease as you get older as well, so you may choose to want to be touched, but it may become more difficult. But we have a question from Uta Saylor as well. And she says, I wonder if the wish for CT touch increased more than the wish for fast touch with deprivation, or was it the same? And thank you for a great talk, she says as well. But you saw that there weren't many differences between the speed of touch?
No, we didn't find many differences. We also didn't expect, or we did expect differences there. That's why we included the fast and slow touch. But we didn't find much differences there. And we also, so we only asked participants to indicate whether they want to be touched, where we define touch as just the word touch in general, more or less by others. And I think in one of the next talks from Kat's lab, they have looked at more specific forms of touch. And I think that's a really, that really fits nice with the work that we have done.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting that you didn't see differences between the slow touch and the fast touch, because if you took the CT kind of social touch hypothesis, you probably would have predicted this. But I think it's very important, as you say, to highlight that social touch and the appreciation of touch in general isn't just CTs. CTs are likely there for the emotional evaluation, this component, the addition of this emotion, but you very much need that actual touch. And it sounds like people just wanted to be touched, never mind if it was slow or fast. They just
exactly. And I remember, so one of the conclusions of our paper is also that it could be that when touch deprived, even less appealing forms of touch, like fast touch, might become more appealing. And I think so. That was that's what our study showed. But I think that's also more or less dangerous conclusion, because you should also be very careful in concluding that more negative forms of touch can be rated as pleasant in the face of touch deprivation, because that also brings with it a big Me Too discussion, I think. But at least in our study, when you define unpleasant touch as fast stroking on the forearm, we found that even
not necessarily unpleasant,
even neutral touch becomes more appealing if you are more touch deprived.
Well, it's really interesting. I think we might have time for just one quick last question. Another question that's come in from Rita Griesch. She says, a really interesting study. It's so important study to support the view that the older generation needs touch and nurture. That's very true. Are there any data about school children? Do you know?
We didn't collect data on children, so we only included participants who were 16 years and older. I think it would be definitely interesting to also have a look at touch needs of children, because I think, at least in the Netherlands, a lot of schools were closed. And if you look at how children play with each other, a lot of their play involves touch. And I can imagine that this is something that they have missed. They were, of course, at home with their parents, from who they hopefully received a lot of positive touch. But I do think that they have also missed the touch with their peers. And that is also what because in our study, the majority of our participants was not living alone. So almost 60% of the participants had someone that they lived with. So either a partner or a friend or other family member. But still, we didn't find a significant difference between the level of longing for touch between people who were living with someone else compared to people who were living alone. So even if you live with people, you might still need touch of other people outside your own small household. And I think the same could definitely be true for children who might receive touch from their parents, but who might also have missed the touch from their friends.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point, that it's, especially for children as well, having to tell a child, no, you can't hug your friend if they've fallen over, something like that, then they're developing their social learning. And to have that interrupted is difficult.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
We hope that there won't be repercussions in the future because of this.
Yeah.
But yes, we'll finish there just to stay on time. A very big thank you again. That was really interesting. And yes, I think we'll definitely like to follow a lot of this up, and looking forward to the research coming out as well.